This is the Uncollared Podcast, off-the-cuff conversations with three pastors at the intersection of religion, politics, and culture. My name is Todd, Leonard. I'm senior pastor at Glendale City Church of Seventh-day Adventists. In a moment, I'll be joined by Galen Goben, an ordained minister with the Christian church, Disciples of Christ. And today we're pleased to welcome Kurt Poland, pastor with First German United Methodist Church of Glendale. Today our conversation is entitled Lent, Good Times with Death. I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, guys, it's great to be with you. Kurt, very glad to have you join us today for the conversation. And today we're going to reflect a little bit on the season of Lent. We're all pastors journeying annually through this time of the Christian year. Lent gets a bad rap, I think, for being being a downer, when I think there's some incredibly profound things that can happen for us spiritually when we reflect on our humanity and the limits of our humanity and the limits of our life. You know, there's so much of our faith that talks about resurrection and about going into the afterlife when we die. And it seems like we tend to skip over the crucial moment of when we actually do die, and how that impacts us as we're approaching that for ourselves, and that how that affects us as others in our lives pass away. And so I'm wondering what you guys want to talk about today, and what your thoughts are around the importance of death and embracing death, especially at this time of year.
You know, I spent 25 to 30 years working around bereaved people and dealing with grief and loss, and one of the things that it has really taught me is that death is the thing really that brings ultimate value to life, because it makes life in short supply, and it makes those things that are important even more important. One of the things that has really happened for me over these last in particular 25 years, where I've spent a deep amount of time in working around bereaved people and in the funeral vocation, is that it has really enhanced my life.
Wow.
It has enhanced the value of my life as I have come to understand the shortness of life and its unpredictability.
How many church services do we actually have where we actually take people through coming to grips with dying?
This is the thing that drives me just batty about so much Christian faith, because it is so built on triumphalism that there's no room for death and sorrow.
Yeah.
Which is where our faith comes from. We want to hang on to Jesus's words in John. There are people here who will not taste death. Okay, that's me. I'm not going to taste death. The hell you're not. You know, I'm sorry, but death kind of has a good track record here, and that's what makes it so hard.
You said that part of Christianity's growth in its history was that, in the past at least, Christianity was valued because Christians focused on honoring the process of death and the process of burial, that it was a very sacred time.
Yeah, that was, and that reference comes from Thomas Long's book, Accompany Them with Singing, which is for pastors. I really encourage you to read that. There's not everything in there that he says that I agree with, but it gives you some great history and some wonderful reasons for why we do the things that we do, and why those things around the funeral and rituals and memorials that we do are really important. But yeah, that was something that he said that in the Roman Empire, it had Christians were people that cared for the dead and did so with dignity and compassion and with presence and all of the stuff that you think about with your own person dying, what you want them to have. Christians brought a sense of compassion and dignity and presence with that this was a sacred moment. And I think we began to lose that sense when, we as a faith got tied in with empire, Constantinople and Constantine and all of that. We got connected in with empire. Well, now we have to support this sense of, yeah, hey, it's always bigger and better. We're always, and you can't talk about death and suffering and sickness and illness because that is a bad thing. We see it playing out now with so many churches that go directly from Palm Sunday, which is, hey, King Jesus comes into Jerusalem, to Easter Sunday, which is, hey,
Mhm.
King Jesus has resurrected, and we go to the tomb and stuff, but oh, he's not there. And they skip Good Friday. You don't get Easter without Good Friday.
Yeah.
You do not get resurrection without death, because you have to die first to encounter resurrection.
So Todd, the question was, is there an attitude toward death or sort of a space in the life of the church that is uniquely opened or nurtured or platformed by the season of Lent, that it isn't necessarily that isn't platformed or nurtured or sort of focused on in the same way in other seasons, in other times in the life of the church? So something that I've been deeply struck by as we're on this, I've been deeply struck by recently is timekeeping and rhythms. It is now 2021 years since the birth of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the idea that the birth of Christ is very, very, that we anchor our time to the birth of Christ and not to the resurrection of Christ is quite interesting. So it's the year 2021, the year of our Lord 2021. It is also the Lenten season. And it is, I learned from my secular Jewish grandfather, like 25 years ago, how we calculate when Easter is going to be. Do y'all know how Easter is calculated? I think it's interesting. It's the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox.
Yep.
So it's anchored to the rhythms of the moon, the rhythms of the sun, and the rhythms of the week. It's a fascinating way of keeping time. So what that then means is that we are on the eve, the long eve of resurrection. In Easter and in Lent, we're waiting the kind of long day before Christ dies, and then we sort of wait, and then we're waiting the long night for the morning. And so something about being able to sort of stay through the day and the night is, I think, inherent in whatever it is that Lent prepares us for. I think it's a different kind of waiting. And I think, there are these incredible moments in the last hours of Christ where his disciples can't wait through the night. They fall asleep,
No.
And so something about being able to stay awake with Christ through the day and through the night, rather than just through the day into the night, late into the night. I don't know, something about that. I don't know. It's a different way of keeping time. I don't have any kind of grand conclusions to draw from that, save to say that I do think that Easter, Good Friday and Easter Holy Week, more than Christmas, are the holidays, the high holy days that are associated with death, directly so.
Absolutely.
And so where we keep the clutch in on Good Friday, we can't let the clutch out on Easter Sunday morning. And so one wonders what it means to let the clutch all the way out on Good Friday in order to be able to let the clutch all the way out on Easter Sunday.
Without, and I never pronounce this correctly, but Triduum, which is the Triduum, which is the Holy Week, the Thursday night, Friday, Saturday to Easter Sunday morning. It is the great festival of the church. Always has been until, well, it is in the more Orthodox churches and the liturgical churches. Triduum, that 3 days in there basically. Without that, we don't have Christmas, because nobody knows, nobody cares. There's no point in everything, and it's all of one piece. I mean, Triduum, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, which is another part of that waiting period that you touched on, Kurt. And I can't think of her first name now, but Rambo wrote this wonderful book about reclaiming Holy Saturday as a part of of our of our Christian faith. This sense of waiting in the tomb,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
and then moving on to Easter Sunday. It's all of a whole. You cannot separate them out piece by piece. So they're all interconnected. And
Yeah.
Alexander John Shia, who has his program is called Quadrados, which is a wonderful look at the Gospels and the use of the Gospels in faith and development. He talks about Lent being the great retreat for the church, that we can learn to retreat into, and we can learn to receive a lot from that. Unfortunately, I think has gotten turned into this, I'm self-flagellation, and I'm going to give up coffee or chocolate donuts or something like that to know the suffering of Christ, because that's really hard for me. I have one every day. Um, and all that really there is a much deeper, beautiful element to this time of Lent that draws us into death. When you do finally learn to let go of things and let go of so much of what we hold as mainstream and in our faith and in our life, to look at something completely different.
Mm-hmm.
Louise and I right now are reading The Cloud of Unknowing. I don't know if y'all
Oh yeah, I love that
that
text.
right now.
I've got that
We've
right here.
had a history and tradition of reading things in the morning for a devotional, and we're on that right now. And so much of it is about letting go, and letting go of everything and letting God. Well, I'll tell you something, to get it to really be a contemplative person and to do contemplative prayer is really, really hard, because there's a lot of yourself you have to let go, which feels like to the ego a death.
Yes, totally.
And literally it is. It is a death. And so in some ways we get to practice our death as we meditate, as we learn to let go of things and the way that we look at it. And Lent gives us a period of time that we can really practice that in a powerful way, all of us together.
Mm-hmm.
But I love the fact that many Protestant churches are in the the 30 years that I've been in ministry, I've seen that really, really grow. And I think that's something that's really renewable, and would help the church to renew itself in a way. Because I'm telling you, and I'll just say this as a sideline, coming out of this COVID thing, there's going to be a lot of dead churches. There
Mm-hmm.
already were. They were dead
Right.
without a funeral, but there are going to be a lot of funerals with those churches when they open back up again. And instead of having 70 people, there's 12 or 15.
Right. For me, the pandemic has been a year of Lent in a sense, in a
Yes.
real way for me.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's a question I've asked the church repeatedly: is what what do we need to let go of right now? What is it that was part of life prior to pandemic that we
Wow.
don't need when we come back? And so I think in that sense, that's what Lent offers to us on a yearly basis. What you've both been saying
Mm-hmm.
is it really is what needs to die for me. That recognizing that death it can be a very beneficial thing in the cycle of life. That in fact, over the course of our life, there are things that decay and die. Our skin cells need to slough off. Our body needs to regenerate new material for us to continue to live. But in order to do that, it has to get rid of the stuff that's no longer good. And so the death as a rhythm, as Kurt, as you've talked about, the beauty of how the calendar is scheduled and how these things come about, and how it isn't static. It isn't the exact same every year. It because life is never the same from year to year.
Cool.
And so to recognize that ongoing through life, we are going to come to these moments where either death is thrust upon us as someone close to us dies, or there's something within us that we sense needs to die, or we become aware of things in our world that that either need to die or are bringing death, and they need to be stopped from bringing harm to the world. But again, Lent apart from Easter would also be worthless, because if there is no hope that there is new life coming, that there is resurrection coming, then the time of death and sloughing off and of giving up doesn't have a purpose towards new life. But again, you can't. It's not one or the other. It is clearly both in this rhythm.
I have been thinking hard about that recently, Todd. I have I have had the privilege of coming into my ordination as a pastor and the beginning of my full-on career in ministry in the wake of, or kind of right as the liturgical renewal sort of milieu in seminaries was really ramping up and finding its footing. And so I got to benefit richly from that. And I've been thinking a lot, because I think what we're doing is we're having a conversation about time, and we're having a conversation about what brings time alive. And, reflection on mortality is a vital part of recognizing the scarcity of our time. One of the really curious things about the liturgical seasons, Lent included, is that they are cyclical. If one follows the general kind of ecumenical lectionary, we have 3 cycles, but they have the same holidays. It's cyclical. And there are entire ways of engaging with the foundations of reality that grow out of a pre-critical sort of orientation to time that understands all of time to be cyclical. This is the worldview of like the Upanishads for the most part, or most Zen Buddhist reflection on life. So, for instance, I had some of my faith in creation given back to me as I started discovering the haiku of Matsuo Basho. And one of the beautiful things about haiku is that it is almost necessary for the form itself that it makes some reference to the season. And so it is with joy that I beheld bright leaves, green leaves, or fresh leaves, green leaves, bright in the sun, has an implication of a springtime setting. Or one of my favorite Basho poems, white hibiscus and white paper walls illuminate each other in this quiet room. And white hibiscus in Japan bloom in the late autumn. And so it's like you have the seasons are really important for the meaning and the orientation to life, which is this kind of wabi-sabi, this kind of Zen, cheerful resignation to the deep rhythms of the world. And even in kanji, the character for heaven, which I don't know how it's vocalized in Japanese, but in Chinese it's qian, is the same word, the same kanji for nature. Heaven and nature are the kind of the same in even in the language. I think, right? I'm going to get somebody come slap me down and tell me that's wrong. But all that to say, haiku has taught me has begun to open up to me how what a gift it is that we have the cycles of the seasons, and that we have the cycles of time that are never the same, even when they come back. But what's also really powerful, and I don't know if it's paradoxical, but it's certainly it I don't quite know how to square it all, is that there is in a biblical faith, I would say both a Jewish and a Christian take on Scripture, on the significance of what God has done in history. I think that there is fundamentally an orientation to time in the world that is not cyclical. Things began here, and they are going somewhere else. We began in Egypt. We were slaves in Egypt, and God delivered us out of the house of bondage unto the promised land, and perhaps even unto Mount Zion, where all the nations will in the fullness of time gather to be taught by God. But we began here, and we are going somewhere else. There is a linear eschatology to the heart of biblical faith that doesn't immediately track with the cyclical, if you want to use the language of eschatology, that I think Matsuo Basho is going to be deeply convicted and inspired by. And yet, with the seasons of the year and the liturgical seasons, there is a cyclical way of even being on this eschatological pilgrimage upon which we find ourselves. And what I find deeply compelling about that is that we can't pretend to have it both ways. It's like those two ontological frames, those two foundational beliefs about what the world and what time are not compatible with each other. But insights and beauty, and you might say even, I don't know if I would say revelations, but at least revelations of sort of access to truths that are uniquely possible when one sort of finds oneself in a world that is headed somewhere different, or in a world in which all things will be brought about again, right? You can port some of the revelations that orientation to living in time open up, even if you don't share the same ontological frame of reference. And that's where I think an emphasis, just a human need to be able to go about our pilgrimage according to the seasons, or at least informed and being able to go about time and live life and give seasons their due. I wonder if that doesn't meet, just on an anthropological level, some kind of deep human need to recognize the cyclical nature of some things, while also having in our heart of hearts the conviction that God began somewhere and is taking creation somewhere else. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but I've been thinking a lot about that. So there it is. So Lent, in that, is a cycle unto death, right? It's part of a cycle where it's the season where I would say that Lent, even more than Advent, is the season of renunciation, the season of fasting and asceticism and letting go. That's why it's the season that Christ is in the desert, right? Even though he's in the desert at the beginning of his ministry and not at the end, but we bring Lent to an end by the end of his ministry, right? And so there's a kind of even a little bit of an incongruity there in terms of the actual narrative of the gospel. But all that to say, this year, as I've tried to put all these ideas that are kind of resounding in my head, in my heart, as I've tried to find something in earnest and honest to preach to my congregation about what we might do now in Lent at the end of quarantine, I found myself following that kind of cloud of unknowing, and then later on St. John of the Cross insight that the life of discipleship is not about adding things to our lives, but about removing things until the only thing needful is left. And I really resonate with that. And so I just said, essentially, find what it is that you need to let go of in order for there to be space for God to get hold of you.
You're talking about a Marie Kondoizing. You're a Marie Kondoizing as part of the gospel.
That's right.
Is leaving behind what brings joy and then what doesn't bring joy, getting rid of it so that more of the joy of God can come in. And I think there's something in each of the rhythms that indeed are cyclical when the kingdom of God is on a direct path that is taking us somewhere else where everything else repeats itself. But even the Christian year is taking us on a journey from one place to another. Even though that's cyclical, it is, we understand that it is a mini expression of the eternal journey with God. And even the 7-day week is a movement, for people of the Jewish faith, and because I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, and the Seventh-day Sabbath is the end of the week for us. The idea of Sabbath is the arrival at paradise. It is that place where everything is as it should be. You're together with the ones you love. You are at rest. You are at peace. You are worshiping God. And then you begin the week again as another path towards paradise. And so there is, I think, each of these smaller cyclical rhythms are symbolizing, are metaphors of that long journey that we're moving towards. And again, part of that journey is the death process towards resurrection.
Yeah.
And so I would, and I actually kind of kick this question to both of you, and Galen, I'd be really interested in what you make of this. I think I've been thinking a lot about when I go away from a funeral that just has not lifted the luggage, that just has not, like the way I think Tom Long says it perfectly, death is a preacher at every funeral. And every
Mhm.
preacher who goes to do a funeral needs to be fully cognizant of that.
Yep.
And what I love about his take in Accompany Them with Singing is that the work that book does is to what he would say reground the liturgical, like the worship service of the funeral, reground the funeral in the sacrament of baptism. And it is
Mhm.
really it's a liturgical reflection on what the funeral does. And the whole, even the title, Accompany Them with Singing,
Yeah.
is what the congregation does as we accompany this person on the last leg of their earthly journey
Yep.
before we trust them into the hands of God.
Right.
And the same way that we wash them when we brought them into the body of Christ, we will wash them as we trust them to the eternal care of God. And grounding, like recognizing the power of the liturgy, the work of the people, the ritual of that, and that the gospel itself, that the ritual is an enactment of the gospel, on a level that is different than the proclamation of the gospel, but that can involve that uses, but even contextualizes the proclamation of the gospel, and that the gospel in liturgy can take the death and can take the things that people would want to say about the deceased and what have you, and fold it all together into something that bears witness to what God has done in Jesus Christ and the hope that we have.
Mhm.
In other words, there is a holiness that can be brought to bear in the midst of death that does not seem to be the outgrowth of a natural process, but that seems to be a posture, an attitude, a sensibility, a feeling, a response to the living address of the living God that is different than the kind of wisdom we gain from recognizing that all things pass away, recognizing that all things are impermanent. It seems to me that what happens in a Christian funeral, in which the gospel is proclaimed and in which the liturgy is grounded in the sacrament of baptism, if you will. There's something that happens there. I don't want to say it's super added, but it's almost like it tracks according to a different register. It tracks according to the aspect of our faith that is grounded in this idea that everything is going somewhere, that God is going
Mhm.
to win in the end, whatever that looks like, that there is an eschatological horizon to all that is not God, that will one day be consummated, and we will no longer see through a glass darkly, but we'll see face to face. What is sown in a
Yep.
natural body will be raised the spiritual body. All that stuff is reaching for that. I think that is working with a source in our faith that is different than the source that is the goodness of creation. I think the source in our faith that believes and opens us up to discover the goodness of creation is wonderful and vital and absolutely necessary for mature Christian faith. But I think it is a different source than whatever it is that gives that holiness and that eschatological ring, that great getting up morning faith on a funeral after Good Friday and on Easter Sunday morning, I would say. I don't see the resurrection as an outgrowth of a natural process. I think it is a decisive act of God
Mm.
that is the first fruits of a new creation, and that is, whatever we mean by it, something altogether new.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it certainly is new, but the I guess the two responses I would have to these
Please,
comments here
yes.
are one, every funeral that Christian funeral that I try to do, and I did a lot, being called in, hi, can you come do a funeral for this person? Family needs somebody, and things. And those are always different. I tried to be fair and honest to myself and to them, all the way through that. Um, and have got some to talk about at another time and stuff that were really interesting. But, but one of the things that I might sort of, I guess, I don't know if it's a disagree with, or I just want to ask Tom Long to shift his viewpoint a little bit,
Okay.
is that, to me, the story of the decedent and God's story has got to find interaction.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you take the story of the decedent and find ways that it has fit into God's story, now you give a sense of greater meaning to that person's life, I
Mm-hmm.
believe.
Yes.
There's tremendous amounts of meaning in that person's life anyway. And of course, yes, when we're talking about, the slime balls and I don't want to name names, but the people that we would excise out of the circle that God draws, which is that's a whole nother
That's a whole, yeah.
uncollared
No,
one,
I hear you though. I
you
really
know.
hear you. Yeah.
But
I want to
but
just mention that Shane Kinnison is not on the podcast today. I'm just going to mention
that's right.
that.
By the way,
I have no
yeah.
comment about that. I just wanted to mention he's not here.
Slime
Today.
balls.
Go ahead, Galen.
Baptist slime balls.
I'm not going with Shane. He's inside, but that that intersection of those stories provide greater meaning for the family and the gathered community, as well as I believe the wholeness of God's story moving forward to whatever end that is, that and whenever that is, that eschatological experience that we've been talking about.
Yes.
I think the stories need to be intertwined because naturally we are anyway, which
Right.
is where I would stand on the other side a little bit from what you were saying, Kurt, with the whole of newness and things and nature being, something different from God. If Christ's Spirit is in the midst of all of creation,
Mm-hmm.
there is a goodness involved in everyone and everything.
Uh-huh.
There is Christ involved in all of it. And one of the things this morning that my wife made was that we as disciples, that the cross is an important symbol for us, but the center of our common life as disciples is the table. And if the table is nurturing and welcoming and sustaining, that gives you a different picture on Lent as well as life in general. If the table becomes the central thematic expression of God's love as opposed to the cross. Now there still is, I still think that there is ending and loss and stuff in the midst of that, but it certainly reorients the conversation. And resurrection has a different expression out of that, I believe, than when you come at it simply from one of death and the cross.
So this is really interesting, Galen. So I think what I think what you're saying is when we make when we talk only about Christ died for your sins, I think I agree with you, right? I think that language, even in its various different iterations, I think has become just rinsed in our society now because it's ubiquitous.
Oh yeah,
that one can literally make a career speaking that code, and never really ask oneself what one means by that.
Right.
In the same way that Tucker Carlson can make a career just sort of needling white grievance without ever really talking about what the role of representative government is, or what the role of the market in government ought to be, or how we ought to square up between human sustained thriving and the ways that we have to use and metabolize the natural world. I mean, they're not asking questions about these limit cases. It's just a kind of code that's in the ether now. And so I think that language has become rinsed. Yeah, it doesn't play anymore. There's a wonderful resourcing theological work that's quite short by one of my favorite theologians, Frances Young. She's a British Methodist, a friend of Rowan Williams. It's called Construing the Cross. And the first chapter of that book is an attempt to, well, not even attempt, what she shows is how after the period of the writing of the New Testament into the early second century, what were some of the dominant but now somewhat faded from memory ways that early Christians construed the cross? And one of those was as a sacrifice. And by sacrifice, we're talking about food. In the first century, Jewish world, in and around Jerusalem and the wider countryside, it was rare that one would have a good, animal, except for every few times a year, like when you herd calves or whatever it is. And when you would take that animal, if you would make the pilgrimage to the temple to slaughter at the temple, you would actually eat some of the food from some of the meat from the animal, as would the priests, right? There's a provision there, even in Leviticus, that you can put the fork in, and whatever comes out on the fork you can eat. And so animals were slain even in the form of sacrifice. We didn't eat meat all that often, right? Folks, they were slain that the table might be provided with food that was deeply sustaining the way that meat is. And so very early on, the communion table was construed, the cross was construed by Christians as the place where Christ died, that his body might become our good food. He died that we might feed on his body and have life.
This is my body broken for you.
Amen. What Francis Young taught me how to do is to let go of some of the overly wrought theoretical construals of the atonement and to try to come back to the witness of the scripture, the witness of the wider tradition, and the witness of ongoing Christian experience. And there are ways of construing the cross that don't get much airtime at all in our pulpits or our Bible studies that I would like to see re-enter the conversation. Another one of those is construing the cross as the tree of life. That's where the tradition of putting flowers on the cross actually comes from. Right. And we forget, right, that the tree of life in the garden, God makes no rules about whether or not one can eat from the tree of life. It's knowledge of good and evil. I think you can even read Genesis 3 as 2 and 3 as describing the tree of life as anchoring all creation. I mean, there's a mythological register there. My favorite construal of the cross, the one that just boggles my mind that I love so much, is the sign that was lifted up that comes from that place in Numbers where God sends the snakes against the people, and they're being bitten and poisoned. And it's really unclear whether God has become wrathful and evil and vengeful. And then, God tells Moses to make the serpent out of bronze, and he lifts it up. And this is the motif, the sign that is lifted up, and the people gaze upon it and are healed. That dominates throughout the Christology of the Gospel of John. I love that. The Church of Saint Moses in Israel, there is a beautiful sculpture of the crucified serpent, of the sign that was lifted up. And I just love that, because it scrambles all the dominant imagery that we typically teach kids in Sunday school, that snakes were really Satan in the garden and all this stuff. When here's a serpent that is literally represented up as a prefiguration of Christ himself, right? So all of which is to say, I think that we are coming to the end, and I think that the rise of the importance of the liturgical holidays and timekeeping and all this are maybe a response to we're recognizing the Procrustean nature of some of these over-dominant theories of the atonement. And I think that we're discovering, as we sit and wait and watch with Christ in the garden, that there's more to this than just what's been theorized by Anselm and others. Sorry, the end.
We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. We'd love to get your feedback. Please email us at uncollarpodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on your favorite podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can watch our podcast on YouTube. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.